Starting today, we're gonna live here, so you gotta move out. We'll handle the $2,000 mortgage.
Nancy and Joe grin at us. I felt a headache coming on. But it was just as I had anticipated, so I'm not surprised. All right, then how about a $5,000 mortgage?
A $5,000 mortgage? You guys can't possibly get approved for a mortgage that high.
Seeing my mother-in-law laughing behind Nancy, who was making a complete fool of us, Bob and I exchanged knowing glances. Fine, we're out of here, and we're not giving you any more money, got it?
Yeah, do as you please. You've already taken money from our mother and father, so let's just cut ties moving forward.
Understood. Bob didn't argue. He simply turned on his heel, took my hand, and we left the house. We headed straight to the real estate office. Truth be told, we'd already been preparing to move. While filling out mortgage paperwork at the real estate office, I imagined the future of my sister-in-law and her husband, and I couldn't stop laughing. My name is Susan Johnson, a 37-year-old novelist. I had the good fortune of hitting it big with a novel I wrote when I was young, and ever since, I've made my living as an author. I met my husband Bob when I was 20. The reason we met was because I brought my novel to his company. Bob was the one who backed me up and helped me make my debut as a writer. For about 10 years, we were professionally involved as an editor and author. But when one of my novels won an award, he kind of proposed by confessing his feelings for me. I had been secretly in love with Bob since my debut, so I was over the moon. I remember almost being late for the award ceremony. After we got married, Bob got promoted to editor-in-chief. He's still in charge of my work, and now he's the best partner supporting me both officially and privately. Our life as newlyweds began with moving into Bob's parents' house. To help me focus on my writing, my parents-in-law proposed that my mother-in-law would take care of the household chores while we cover all living expenses. I was making decent money, and Bob was earning even more as editor-in-chief. Neither of us is good at housework, and Bob was often busy around the clock, so we gladly accepted the offer to live with my parents-in-law. My mother-in-law has always been a homemaker, and she's absolutely perfect at keeping the house. The house is always clean, and the food is incredibly delicious. But one concern I have is her extravagant taste. She spends a lot of money on ingredients. For today, USDA prime grade steaks. Yesterday, it was some sort of celebration.
Well, if you're gonna eat, might as well eat something good, right? This steak is from the butcher shop near the station, $35 for 3.5 ounces.
Hearing the price of the steak in front of me, I was speechless. No matter how much Bob and I earn, we can't afford to have luxury items like crab and high-grade steak as a part of our daily meals. But no matter how many times I talked to my mother-in-law about it, she just laughed it off and didn't take it seriously. Bob, isn't $3,000 for food this month a bit excessive? I'm not that into luxury, you know. We'll go bankrupt at this rate.
$3,000. That's almost the same as an entry-level salary. And it's not like we're dining out. I'll talk to Mom about it. Sorry about this.
Since my mother-in-law took care of all the household chores, we had left the shopping and everything else up to her. We were paying with a credit card, so we could easily track the expenses. The next day, Bob immediately took the statement to his mother for a discussion. About 30 minutes later, while I was working, my mother-in-law and Bob came in with a humble knock, and she was with her eyes downcast, looking sorry. I had no idea I was spending $3,000 a month on food. I'm sorry, Susan. No, I should be thanking you. You're the one doing all the housework for us. How about we eat out a few times a month as a token of our gratitude?
Thank you, Susan.
Seeing my mother-in-law's tears of joy made me wish I'd made the suggestion sooner. Since then, she stopped buying unnecessarily expensive groceries, and we enjoyed eating at high-end restaurants about 3 times a month. However, a few months into this lifestyle, things started to change. The turning point was when my sister-in-law and her husband moved nearby. One day, while dining at a restaurant they had reserved as a moving-in celebration, my sister-in-law, Nancy, started picking a fight with me.
Susan, you always stay home, I envy you. Plus, Mom does all your housework, right? Sounds like you're enjoying life.
Even if I'm home, I'm working. Writing novels is my job.
Is that a way to brag about being smart? Anyone can write, you know. You're putting on airs. We're tight on money because we're raising twins, so could you please cover the bill here too?
After saying that, Nancy left the restaurant in a huff with her husband, Joe. Left behind were Bob and I, my parents-in-law, and Nancy's twin children. The twins were already in elementary school, but they were so ill-mannered that my parents-in-law had to look after them the whole time. Nancy just looked at this situation unconcernedly while fiddling with her smartphone, and Joe just kept ordering drinks and was clearly intoxicated. Honestly, their departure didn't trouble me much, but when they pushed me to pay, I jumped in surprise at the register. Your total comes to $2,500. $2,500? There were 6 adults and 2 kids, making it 8 people. The kids' meals were about $50 each, and the adult meals should have been around $250 each. That would sum up to $1,600. Neither we nor my parents-in-law ordered anything extra, which means the remaining $900 was spent by Nancy and Joe on drinks and food. Bob did caution Nancy about this, but she showed no remorse and didn't offer to contribute. To be honest, this was expected, but I was particularly concerned by my mother-in-law's attitude. She was always lenient toward Nancy, dismissing everything with a, "Well, it can't be helped." Even when Bob and my father-in-law tried to reprimand my mother-in-law and Nancy, Nancy simply shot them down with a, "We don't have money." Usually, that might be understandable, but after letting us run an extra $900 tab and making reservations at a fancy restaurant under the guise of a moving-in celebration, yet having no intention of paying, it just didn't feel right to let it slide. But we couldn't directly confront my mother-in-law about this, so in the end, my husband and I were just forced to feel contented about paying for them. Ever since then, my mother-in-law's reckless spending became even more blatant. From theater tickets to Broadway shows, to fancy lunches at high-end restaurants, the credit card statements always showed amounts for 2. She was usually doing all these things with Nancy, and they'd typically leave the twins at our place, disrupting my workflow.
Today, we're going to enjoy some gourmet French cuisine by a renowned chef. Susan, can you look after the kids for us?
Hold on a second. Ignoring my plea, Nancy and my mother-in-law happily left together, and I was stuck chasing around the hyperactive twins all day. Despite several warnings from my father-in-law and Bob, my mother-in-law would say sorry at that moment but leave the twins with us again the next day. Even on weekdays, I found it odd that the twins were freely hanging out at our house. When I asked Bob about it, it turned out the twins were refusing to go to school and were just killing time at home. If things continue like this, I'll never meet my novel deadlines. I boldly suggested that we build another house in the yard and make it on the property. My mother-in-law was thrilled at the idea and immediately started looking for a construction company. My parents-in-law's home had enough land to easily build another house. Having a separate building on the same property would give me the solitude I need to work, and the twins couldn't disturb my living space either. My father-in-law had already mentioned contributing to household expenses, so reasonably we could have him and his wife live separately. Furthermore, after discussing it with my father-in-law, he agreed to also contribute $2,000 a month towards loan repayments as a living inheritance. It seemed that because we were covering all the living expenses, both his salary and retirement benefits had mostly gone into savings. My parents-in-law's house was old, so we eventually decided to rebuild. Expenses piled up, but luckily, I received some royalties from a novel I published last year. Coupled with the $2,000 we were getting from my father-in-law, it looked like we could manage the mortgage payments. My mother-in-law handled the discussions with the construction company, updating me and Bob on the finalized plans. We adjusted anything that didn't sit right with us, and the project moved along little by little. However, Nancy and her husband kept sticking their noses into these discussions, and I had a bad feeling about it. Bob felt the same way. We were checking into Nancy and her husband's background while also preparing a contingency plan. Finally, the new house was ready. On the moving day, as we were waiting for the movers, Nancy and her husband approached us, grinning from ear to ear.
Starting today, we're gonna live here, so you gotta move out. We'll handle the $2,000 mortgage.
Nancy and Joe grinned at us and I felt a headache coming on. But it was just as I had anticipated, so I'm not surprised. All right, then how about a $5,000 mortgage?
A $5,000 mortgage? You guys can't possibly get approved for a mortgage that high.
Seeing my mother-in-law laughing behind Nancy, who was making a complete fool of us, Bob and I exchanged knowing glances. Fine, we're out of here, and we're not giving you any more money, got it?
Yeah, do as you please. You've already taken money from our mother and father, so let's just cut ties moving forward.
Understood. Bob didn't argue. He simply turned on his heel, took my hand, and we left the house. We headed straight to the real estate office. Truth be told, we'd already been preparing to move. While filling out mortgage paperwork at the real estate office, I imagined the future of my sister-in-law and her husband, and I couldn't stop laughing. The new house that Bob found was on a hill with a great view of the ocean. I chose a room with the best view as my workspace and started catching up on my writing. It was just a matter of hours, but when I took a break to check my phone, I had dozens of missed calls. The callers were my mother-in-law and Nancy, and there were also a few voicemails. I deleted all the missed calls, contacted Bob, and went back to writing. That night, as Bob came home and we were eating dinner, he told me about the conversations he'd had with his mother and sister. Apparently, Nancy really thought the mortgage was only $2,000. It's almost like building 2 custom homes, just as my mother-in-law wanted. There's no way we could have done that for just $2,000. Nancy was mad at Bob, saying I'd kept intentionally the real cost a secret, but we had properly gone through the process at the realtor and sent the document with the amount of money to Nancy. Nancy was the one who had agreed to it and sent it back to the realtor. They called to say they felt cheated and demanded that we pay the mortgage. I told them we've cut ties and won't be paying. You good? Well, seems like neither Nancy nor Mom gives a darn about what I say. All they do is nag about money. Honestly, I feel kind of relieved now. I sensed he was putting on a brave face, but I was grateful for how Bob had stood up to protect our lifestyle. My heart warmed, just like it had on our wedding day, and I knew I'd follow him forever. In the end, there was no way Nancy and her husband could pay $5,000 a month, and it turned out that my father-in-law paid the first month's $5,000. But even if from the next month, my father-in-law started contributing $2,000 like he did for us, Nancy and her husband couldn't even come up with $3,000, so the house was quickly put up for sale. After selling the house, Nancy's family and my mother-in-law moved into a rundown apartment nearby. My father-in-law has been divorced from my mother-in-law and living separately for 2 months now. On my way to a meeting near our old home, I was suddenly grabbed and stopped. Susan, I found you, you have to take responsibility. It was Nancy who grabbed me, and I was shocked by how she'd changed. Her hair was a mess, her once beautifully manicured nails were chipped, and she looked older than Bob. Is that you, Nancy?
It's your fault we can't go out and have fun. Take us to your house right now.
I felt terrified by the miscommunication for the first time and immediately started scanning for a nearby police station. Then I noticed my mother-in-law, the twins, and Joe lurking in the shadows, and realized they were dead serious about coming to live at our place. Sorry, I have a meeting. Could you wait at that cafe over there? I'll be done in about an hour. Fine, but make it quick. Nancy and her crew entered the cafe. I rushed to my meeting location. I told Bob, who was already waiting there, about what had happened with Nancy. Let's move to another location quickly. I followed Bob out of the cafe and we both hopped in a cab to head to the publisher's office for our meeting. About an hour in, my phone started ringing, but I ignored it and turned it off. Then Bob's phone started ringing. When Bob reluctantly answered, I could hear Nancy yelling loudly enough for me to hear across the table. It seemed they ordered a bunch at the cafe despite not having any cash. Nancy had called me to pay for it, but since I wasn't picking up, now she was insisting that Bob should take responsibility and pay. Bob's brow furrowed.
What? Susan is with me right now, and you should be paying your own bills at the cafe. Didn't I tell you we're cutting all ties? Because you married that woman, we're in this mess. Divorce her and come home and send money for living expenses. You've always thought it's a given to receive things, but you're old enough to know better now. Handle your business, you've got Joe with you. Bob turned off his phone, just like I did. We continued our meeting and went home together in a cab that night. The next day, when we turned on our phones, we found out that there had been a message from the police and we headed to the police station. Apparently, both Nancy and my mother-in-law were claiming that Bob and I had set them up, which is why they couldn't pay at the cafe. So, it seemed they were claiming that Bob and I were the ones at fault. The police wanted to hear our side of the story just to be sure, so I explained everything, including why I sent them to that cafe and that I had no idea they wouldn't be able to pay. To begin with, it appears that my sister-in-law's family and mother-in-law went wild eating and drinking at the cafe,
racking up a bill close to 50,000 yen. They then apparently caused a scene, claiming the charges were unfair. They reportedly broke cups, threw chairs, and even shattered a windowpane before being restrained by the police. Bob and I immediately went to apologize to the cafe owner. Luckily, the owner was understanding and said we were not at fault. I was still feeling guilty for directing them to that cafe, but the owner asked, instead, if we could testify and provide information when they take legal action against my sister-in-law's family and my mother-in-law. Bob and I agreed and told the police we would not vouch for them anymore. That night, we unexpectedly heard from my father-in-law. "I'm sorry for the trouble. I declined to vouch for them, and it seems they tried to reach out to Bob." "Dad, where are you staying right now?" My father-in-law had helped us multiple times when we lived together and had even warned my mother-in-law and Nancy. It was also my father-in-law who sensed the schemes of my mother-in-law and Nancy, and advised us to find another place to live. Truth be told, we wanted to take my father-in-law with us, but he had told us to wait until he contacted us when his divorce from my mother-in-law was finalized. So, we waited. "I'm staying at a hotel right now. How about you come live with us? The divorce is finalized, after all." My father-in-law hesitated but agreed with a warm smile when he saw Bob nodding in agreement. Once he moved in, he dropped a bombshell on us. "Actually, Nancy is not my daughter." "What?" Turns out, Nancy was apparently the child born from an affair my mother-in-law had back in the day. Bob was about to hit puberty when it was discovered, and since the news broke during the late stages of pregnancy and they had already shared with others that a second child was on the way, my father-in-law, realizing that Bob and Nancy shared half their blood, decided not to go through with the divorce. We were at a loss for words when we heard that. Moreover, learning that the mother-in-law was still in touch with that man and that was why she had spoiled Nancy, Bob let out a dry chuckle. "That makes sense. I've been thinking that Mom turned cold even before Nancy was born. So that's why." "Bob, I'm sorry. I was gonna take this secret to the grave, but I didn't want to hide anything from you and Susan after all you've done for us." "I'd rather thank you for telling me. It all makes sense now." Bob, with a relieved expression, grabbed his phone and started dialing. "Yeah, hey. It's me. I'll hear you out. Meet us at the private dining place near the train station next week." After saying that, Bob hung up the phone. Then, smiling at my puzzled father-in-law and me, he started talking about the plans for next week. Come the day to meet after a long time at the private dining place, my mother-in-law, her daughter, and the daughter's husband were already there. Apparently, the twins were staying at home. I felt relieved hearing that. "Susan, after all I've done for you, how could you be so ungrateful?"
"It's Mom who's ungrateful. We've been covering all the bills, you know. And it was you who proposed that deal in the first place. We've been holding up our end."
"Bob, keep your mouth shut. Whose side are you on, your mother or that woman?"
"Considering you had an affair while married and had Dad raise that child, all while continuing the affair, I care about Susan more than a mother like that."
"Why do you?" Seeing her mother's flustered reaction, Nancy looked dumbfounded at first, but soon she seemed to understand and her face went pale. Then she looked at my father-in-law and began speaking in a cutesy voice. "I'm your daughter, right? This is a lie, right? Susan, you're making up stories again." "It's not a lie, it's the truth."
"What?"
Nancy said that, losing all her initial vigor. Next to such a dejected Nancy, Joe was leisurely ordering and sipping his drink. "Well, that's beside the point, but how much are you gonna give me?" "Excuse me? I mean, the support, that's what we're discussing today, right?" Joe, seemingly misunderstanding something, said this while grinning and swirling his drink around. For a brief moment, we were all taken aback by his audacity, but soon my father-in-law corrected him. "We won't be giving you any financial aid. We're cutting ties with you. We won't be seeing each other again." "Kidding, right? How much a month? $2,000? $3,000? I don't want to work, so I'd prefer at least $4,000 if possible." Despite my father-in-law's words, Joe continued with his brazen demands. Bob was smiling the entire time. But his eyes weren't. In front of this unamused Bob, Joe kept his sneering smile and began munching loudly on his snack. Then, Bob replied with a beaming smile. "Don't mooch off others for an amount you've never earned yourself." "Excuse me? You a baker or something?" You're old enough, you have kids, don't spend other people's money on them. Why should the money Susan and I worked so hard for go to a stranger? We've cut ties, and we're not giving you a cent. Bob, while maintaining his smile, said this all in one breath. Joe was taken aback and was completely frozen. In reality, Bob is generally calm and speaks politely. But when he gets angry, his tone can turn sharp even while smiling. Therefore, among the editorial staff and authors, he's teased as the smiling devil. Susan, Dad, and I are complete strangers now, so you all better work hard and fend for yourselves. If you come close again, I'm gonna call the police.
How could you say such things to your own mother and sweet sister?
I said I've cut ties. You're not my mother anymore, and my sister isn't sweet. She's a complete stranger now. The firm rejection from Bob left my mother-in-law, Nancy, and Joe speechless. As a parting gift to them, we left some bills on the table for the reservations we made at the restaurant and then left. After that, my father-in-law began living with us full-time. There was always spare room, and he's a quiet man, never interferes with my work, so there were no issues. For house chores, we decided to hire a housekeeper, so our place is always comfortable. Our father-in-law has gotten really into writing poems in his spare time. He writes astonishingly beautiful poems and recently even won an award in a poetry contest. It seems my mother-in-law was abandoned by her adulterous lover. The moment my father-in-law asked for the return of a debt from the mortgage, the other man took off. Turns out the guy she had an affair with was also married, and when his family found out about Nancy, it became a total mess. Eventually, it seems she continued to live with her daughter and son-in-law. I heard they are both big spenders, so they're piling up debt and struggling financially. By the way, the twins were apparently abandoned by Nancy and were taken into custody. They're now in a children's home. I heard that they've started attending school and have become much more well-mannered than before. As for me, I found out I'm expecting. I had given up thinking I could never have children, so it was quite a shock. Bob, being a worrier, has become even more overprotective. He's been jotting down notes on my health every day, which feels a bit too much, but we're living very happy days. I think about incorporating the stories of my mother-in-law and my sister-in-law's family into my writings someday. I looked out the window at the ocean, deciding to focus on giving birth first and then start writing a new book.